Composing music for the harp is a unique challenge, but we're going to help you get started here next. Hello and welcome to the Musician Toolkit, episode number 28. I am David Lane, your host, and it is great to be with you once again. Back on episode 18, we talked about the clarinet, and I mentioned how this is the first of an occasional series that we'll have called the Instrumental Spotlight series that may happen once a quarter or twice a year. I'm not sure how often. It's going to be spread out over hopefully the long life of this podcast. So I just want to say up front, and just in case you thought this was the second of that series, it's not. Down the road, we will talk about the harp as part of the official Instrumental Spotlight series, but that series is for learning how best to play for it. We'll include some information about composing as well, so it would be a more thorough overview. But this is a very specific look at the harp. If you are a composer, an orchestrator, or an arranger, every instrument has its unique challenges, but the harp sometimes feels like a special case. As we mentioned, it's not really a chromatic instrument because you can't quickly and easily play a chromatic scale like you can on other instruments. But at the same time, you do have the option fairly quickly of having any of the 12 pitches of the chromatic scale. When you're composing for harp, one of the big problems that composers have is that very often they happen to be pianists as well and not have much experience playing the harp. And so there's a lot of assumptions. For example, the harp and the piano both play on the same grand staff, usually treble clef on top, bass clef on the bottom. They have a fairly similar range. The harp is just a little bit narrower on the low and high end of the piano. And at a quick glance, the music looks similar in terms of what to play and the types of patterns you get. There are some things that you can do to get better at learning how to compose for the harp. One of the things you can do is get out an orchestration textbook. Another thing is to do some score study on orchestral scores that have harp parts or just harp music in general. And to be sure, you're going to learn some of what you need to know just from doing that, but you probably might not learn everything. Another good thing that you, of course, can do is talk to harpists, talk to them, ask them what they like to play, what are the things that they prefer to see in music and what do they prefer not to. And I think that's a step up from just doing score study or just reading orchestral textbooks. But maybe your best overall solution is a harpist who specializes in new music, who loves to collaborate with composers, who is not only aware of what the harp can do and what composers like to do, but is willing to go with the back and forth to kind of come up with new things that the harp can do, but also while helping the composers to understand what is actually easy to play and what is a challenge to play and what might not come off exactly. So we're going to be talking today about the harp as an instrument, as a pragmatic instrument. What are the things that the harp does well? What are the things that you should probably think twice about before you compose to the harp? So my guest today is exactly that fourth type of resource that I described. Her name is Danielle Kuntz. She specializes in new music for the harp, collaborating with composers, but she also has a consulting program that composers and arrangers can subscribe to learn more about the limitations and the options that you have when composing for the harp. So here's my conversation with Danielle Kuntz. Well, Danielle, it's great to have you on the podcast. And like so many other people in 2023, kind of feel like we know each other already, but we're meeting for the first time. It's like I know you through Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, but it's great to meet you in person.
Yeah, absolutely. No, the pandemic is great for building a lot of connections, and I feel like a lot of the work that I do is from people I met on Twitter. So, yay, Twitter.
Yes. uh, Although I'm not on Twitter as much lately, which maybe I think I know a few people that are kind of like that, finding other places to go. But a lot of people still find it valuable. It's where they built a community in the first place. And for me, I kind of went from Facebook to Instagram, then to Twitter. So I guess I don't have quite as much of a stake in that as others. But that's why there's a lot of social media platforms for all people out there.
And it's cool to kind of interact with the same people across different platforms because you're like, oh, I know you. Oh, you're here too. And you
Yeah.
really get to know people just seeing them different places.
So today we're going to be talking about the harp, but specifically in terms of how it's perceived by the composer or the arranger, or the harpist playing new music by a composer or an arranger. So you are uniquely qualified for that because this is kind of your mission as you market yourself, online. As I see you, you are talking specifically to composers and arrangers about harp music. And just what kind of led you to this path? Because I know that you started off as kind of a mainstream classical harpist. So tell us a little bit about your journey to this point.
Yeah, so there's been a couple things that really led me to this point. The first thing is I felt a little dissatisfied with the existing harp repertoire,
Hmm.
just because there's not as much of it there as other instruments. Especially going back, the further back you go, the less music that you have. So like the harp, there's not many pieces from the classical era. We start to get a little bit more in the romantic era. We get a lot more in the contemporary era, but it's still a lot more sparse than like the piano repertoire, the violin repertoire, and so on. So I was one who was always like wanting more. I played piano for a while just because I enjoyed a little bit more variety in the repertoire, but physically it was just a lot to keep up with two instruments. So I was like, oh, let's get more music on the harp. The other thing that kind of led me to that point is a lot of my friends in school were composers, so they started writing for the harp, and I was like, "Oh, this is cool! I have people writing music for me." So I started, collaborating with them. It was a really fun endeavor. But along that route, I kind of realized there's not a lot of great resources out there for composing for the harp. And there's a lot of reasons for that. We can delve into that a little bit later in the discussion. But I started really exploring, okay, how do you write for the harp in a way that's idiomatic, that's comfortable, but still gives room for exploration and trying new things. And that's really kind of what led me to this point where right now, pretty much exclusively what I do is contemporary music. I call it new music. It's not all avant-garde, crazy
Right,
music. Some of it is. I love that, but it's also
right.
really cool to have more traditional, more accessible new music as a way to help get other musicians involved in new music when they don't have that same contemporary music experience. So I'm all about newly composed music and also empowering composers to be able to write for the harp confidently, effectively, and in a way that harpists will be able to also play the music.
Right. And the harp is definitely a unique instrument. I mean, one of the things that I kind of cringe about is as a composer myself is I think it was probably close to 20 years ago that I wrote my first piece for harp. I didn't know anybody who played harp at the time. My wife had not yet taken it up. My wife is a violinist, violist who, in her 30s, decided, she'd always wanted to learn harp. So she started with a folk harp, got one with, levers on all the strings. And then, about 4 years ago, finally bought, her first concert grand and so forth. But before then, I didn't know anybody, and nor the community that she had met in this area. And the University of Indiana has like an annual competition for composers as part of
Mhm.
their big harp competition. So I wrote a piece, and my wife's teacher, maybe about 8 or 9 years ago, said she was interested in taking a look at it. So for the record, I was runner up, or I mean, I don't even know. That may have been just a case of you were 100th place. I don't know what it meant, but I didn't win. But the teacher took a look at it, and she says it's really good. If I could just make some edits, and what I got back hardly resembled what I wrote in the first place, and I was using an orchestration book and so forth. So I thought I knew a lot, going in. I think most composers think they know more than they do until they have that experience. But um, it was it was pleasing to me that the last harp piece that I wrote and had someone edit didn't need that much attention to it. But harp is one of those instruments that I always want to have a performer take a look at. And I think the more that we composers know in advance, the better, so that
Mhm.
it's not such an overwhelming edit when that happens.
And
But
I tend to, suggest to composers like work with a harpist early in the process, so that way you can get your sketches, get your initial ideas, kind of, explore it with a harpist, have them play it, see how it sounds. Then you can develop that into a full piece, because there's nothing more frustrating than having an idea, you develop it into a whole piece, and then realize that initial idea doesn't really work on the harp, and then you have to rewrite
right,
everything. Like that's not fun for everyone, for anyone.
like,
So
yeah,
having,
and
that collaboration happen earlier rather than later saves everyone a lot of time and frustration.
right. I mean, if you're composing or arranging, it's a good idea to know something, about each instrument. But the harp is unique to me in a couple of ways. First of all, it's not included, at least in my experience, in like your instrumental methods courses. There are courses you can take in school for string methods, brass, percussion, woodwind, and the harp doesn't really get included in that. And one of the reasons for that is like there aren't really a lot of like harps that you want on masses of students playing. It's like they're very expensive instruments. But also I kind of I categorize the harp along with the timpani in
Mhm.
kind of a in a weird pairing, and and that is that you have to really strategize what can be played. So like the timpani, the obvious limitations are you have four drums that you can count on most orchestras having, and each drum has a range, and also so you can have four notes at once. It takes time and a little bit of effort to retune each drum in the middle of a performance, so you
Mhm.
have to always be aware of, okay, what four timpanis do I have now, which one can I change, how long do they have to change it, and I think to me that's the most extreme example. But a harp is kind of similar. You have seven different strings that you can have at once, so to me it's not truly a chromatic instrument. It's funny, my wife had a documentary about the harp history on YouTube this morning, and someone said, that the harp is a chromatic instrument because of the pedals. But I have to disagree because you can't quickly, as easily as, an instrument with three valves,
Mhm.
as easily as a piano change. So that's the most obvious difference, between a piano and harp to me is that the harp is limited to seven notes at a time, but a good harpist can quickly change any of those seven notes in ways that I think that are creative beyond, what a pianist can do. And I'll be sure to share one of my favorites before we're done. But what are some other ways that the harp differs from the piano in terms of an instrument that you can play?
Yeah, so there's a lot of differences between the harp and the piano, but there's also a lot of similarities. So I actually, when I'm talking about to composers about writing for the harp, I do try to highlight those similarities and differences with the piano just to make it a little bit more down to earth. So the range is pretty similar between the piano and the harp. The piano has a little bit more of a range.
Hmm.
The difference is the resonance of the harp. So the piano is going to automatically dampen the notes unless you're intentionally sustaining using like a damper pedal or holding down the keys with your finger.
Hmm.
The harp is going to sustain indefinitely depending on the range that you're working on, unless you have a second action to come in and stop the sound. So that's a very different way of thinking about it. It has huge ramifications for writing for the harp. And the big thing is the lower strings are going to resonate a lot longer than the higher strings. So the low strings on the harp, they can ring for up to a minute, like a really long time, those big wire strings. Whereas the ones on the top, they'll decay really quickly. So there's a lot of nuance in that and different ways that you can utilize these different registers.
Hmm.
But, it's not like the piano, it's not clean in that
Yeah.
sense. You have more of that muddy sound, so you have to be a little bit more strategic with the registers. Another similarity and difference is pianists and harpists, we both use two hands. So we do have that, polyphonic option to be able to play multiple voices at the same time. But there are some key differences. On the piano, number one, you're using 5 fingers. On the harp, you only use 4. The reason is the pinky finger is way too short to reach the strings. And funny story, I had one composer comment on some thread I was on somewhere saying, I just don't understand why harpists refuse to use their pinky finger. Like, why won't they even try? I still laugh about that because it's not that we refuse to use it. It's just it's too short to work, and no matter what the problem is or the pattern is that you're trying to play, like any other solution is going to work better than trying to use the pinky finger. And that's just because of the modern instrument with the tension and the spacing of the strings. There were some earlier harps where harpists were using 5 fingers, and that's a whole other tangent that we can go down. But
Right.
harp, 4 notes at a time per hand, you can only play 4 fingers. Piano, there's 5. The other thing is that the layout of the hands on the piano, the hands are oriented opposite each other. So you have thumbs in the middle, fingers on the outside. So if you're thinking about like natural interval spacing on the piano, you're going to be a little bit more comfortable having smaller intervals on the top of a chord, or on the outside of the chord, rather, outside of the chord,
Right.
or larger intervals between the thumb and the second finger, so on the inside of the chord. There's exceptions, but that's kind of your general layout. The harp is a little bit different, whereas the hands are going to be oriented in the same direction, so thumbs on top, fingers on bottom.
Hmm.
So if you're thinking about that natural interval spacing, it's always going to be the tops of the chords that you want to have slightly larger intervals. Seconds are a little bit less idiomatic on the top of the
Right.
chord. Not impossible, but it moves the whole hand up, which means you can't reach as far for the bottom. So there's a lot of like little details. I have a whole spreadsheet that I give to
Right.
composers who take my course with like, these are the intervals that work between these fingers if you want to go down and be that nitpicky. And then similarly, large intervals on the bottom of a chord are difficult because you don't have that big of a reach between your fourth and your third fingers. So there's some little differences in the interval layout and the hands and things like that. And then you have the obvious chromaticism. And I think you said it really well. The harp, you have access to 7 notes at a time, 7 pitches or pitch classes if you want to be a little bit more technical. Piano, you have access to 12.
Right.
Of course, the piano, you only have 12. You can't do microtones, which
Yep.
everyone's like, we want to do microtones now. Piano, you have 12. Harp, you have 7. You can be really strategic, though, in how you navigate that. It doesn't have to be, those 7 notes don't have to be a straight scale. You
Right.
can have any kind of order because you have access to 3 pitches per string with the pedals, flat, natural, and sharp. So you can do a whole lot with that as long as you're aware there's only 7 pitches you can do at a time unless you're changing pedals to change those pitches, but it's still only 7. No matter what you do, you only
Right.
have access to 7 pitches at a time.
Right. Probably worth noting, that we're talking about a pedal harp, or, known as a concert grand. There is, of course, you can have just a plain old full harp, which, basically it's kind of like writing for harmonica. You kind of got to know what key you're in and stay in that
Right.
key. But you also have lever harps where you can, sharp, well, I don't know how it works. I guess you really only go in one way, right? Like you can
You
tune
can
it.
only go one way, but you can start with different
Yeah,
tunings.
right.
So most lever harpists will tune the E flat just because that gives the most diatonic key options. My lever harp is tuned to E flat,
Right.
but you can adjust the tuning if you want to.
Right.
And what's really cool about the lever harp, so the pedal harp is going to be changing all the pitches across the harp. So you change the C
Yes.
pedal to sharp, all the C's on the harp are sharp.
Hmm.
The lever harp, you can only change one at a time, which is a little bit limiting if you're thinking diatonically.
Yeah.
But if you want to write, bitonal music or go crazy, you can literally have different keys across the harp, which is really
Right.
cool and I think needs to be explored more. Plus,
One
there's
of my
so many harpists who only play lever harp and they want music, and there's so little good music out there for lever harp. So, composers out there, write for lever harp.
Yes.
You'll get your music played if you write it well, but
Right.
there's that always that caveat. Write for
Right.
lever harp.
One of my favorite aspects of harp, especially, pedal harp, is where the different ways that you can combine the strings to come up with some very interesting glisses. Like one of the cliches. that I was so happy to discover how to do is diminished seventh gliss on the harp,
Mhm.
which is harder on the piano to make that arpeggio sound. But like if you want just for example, a C diminished seven, you just have to take your seven letters and you just think, well, you have your A, B sharp, C, D sharp, B flat, F sharp, G flat. And that's all you have to do is just kind of set those pedals and then just you gliss up and down and it sounds great and very natural. But you could also, if you're a composer, it doesn't have to be, that obvious. You can come up with all kinds of interesting scales, flat certain tones, sharp others. Um, and your technique with your hands is going to be pretty much the same.
Mhm.
Whereas, if you put that on the piano, you might have to come up with a different fingering pattern or something like that. So,
Like
uh,
what's fun is you can actually rearrange the pedals so you can have, up and down steps in a ascending scale, which there's actually one section in the Ravel introduction in Allegro where we re-pedal it just a little bit to make it fit the hand so you can hear that up and down, but we're actually playing notes straight up physically. It's super cool because
right.
playing notes in the same direction works a lot better on the harp. And that goes into like the motions of playing. It just takes a little bit more motion on the harp to play a note than on the piano. So thinking and things going a little bit more linearly helps. But there's creative things that you can still do with that, like pedals.
Whenever I hear statements, that begin with the phrase nobody or everybody, I always like to check it, whenever I can. And one of the things I hear is that everybody changes the way Waltz of the Flowers cadenza is written. I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
that's is that the case with you? It's
Yeah, it
like,
is the case.
yeah, it's like
So I
Tchaikovsky
think
didn't write that very well, apparently.
I I've heard a lot of different theories about it, and it's possible that he just wrote a something that was supposed to be ad-libbed,
Yeah,
essentially. But the way that it's written with the opposing hand arpeggios, it sounds clunky. It doesn't sound very flowy. So we rewrite that, and that's just kind of like a written edit that is passed down from harpist to harpist to harpist, where we play that just as straight descending arpeggios. There are actually a few harpists that play it as written, which is really interesting. But there's so many of these like unspoken rewrites in the orchestral literature, which is doesn't help anyone in all honesty. Like we need to get these codified because number one, you're relying on being able to have access to this handwritten rewrite that you've gotten from your teacher and your teacher's teacher and passed
mhm,
down. And if you didn't get access to this one part, harpists we're all over the Facebook groups like, hey, do you have the rewrite for such and such a piece? I have to play it in a concert and the librarian doesn't have the rewrite for me
mhm.
situation. But also composers who are looking at orchestral music to learn how to write for the harp, they're reading the originals. They're not
Yeah,
reading the rewrites. So a lot of the time, what you see on IMSLP is not what harpists are actually going to be playing.
right. And that kind of brings us to the next thing. There are scores that we can look at to get some idea, and as you say, may not always be the best advice, but there are also orchestration books out there. And I just wanted to just kind of pick your brain to see what do you think that they generally do well, and what do you think what are they leaving out?
So a lot of the orchestration books I found really focus heavily on the pedals, which is important for sure. Glissandos, which is a big feature of the harp, and extended techniques.
Right.
Those are all great, but I feel like that leaves out a lot because, in all honesty, a lot of the difficult and awkward music I encounter often has nothing to do with the pedals. Sometimes it does, but most of the time it really has to do with like the layout of the notes and how those notes fit in the hands. So I would say if you're wanting to learn how to write for the harp, there's a couple other resources I highly advise. The first one is Yolanda Condé Nast's book, Writing Well for the Modern Harp. That's really the best book I found to really go through and detail how to understand and write for the harp. Most of the orchestration books are just incomplete. Adler's really incomplete. It's
Mhm.
okay. It's not bad. It's just really incomplete. So that's where I would probably start. And then I have a couple other resources that we could include in the show notes if we want to.
Okay,
But there's a lot that you need to think about beyond what you're going to find in the orchestration books.
great. So I know we talked about the hand difference, especially between the piano, is definitely something that you have to keep in mind when you're writing for harp. Um, Tell us a little bit about the range. You like the registers of the harp act differently. I
Mhm.
know. So tell us a little bit about like when you're considering the range of the harp.
Yeah. So if you're looking, in most of the orchestra books online, most places will categorize the harp into three different ranges. So the low range where you have the wire strings, the mid range where you have the gut strings, and then the top range where you have the nylon strings.
Mhm.
All of those strings have a slightly different tone quality just because of the nature of the strings. I like to actually divide the harp into four categories or four ranges just because that reflects a little bit more of how it works. So I still think of it the low range, which has your wire strings as the bottom octave and a half of the harp. Then you have your mid low register, which is where you get the gut strings up to about middle C. And this register has that really warm sound that you get from the gut strings, but it still has that long resonance that you would have from the low strings. So that's where you tend to get that really muddy register if you're writing too fast or have intervals too close together.
Yeah.
That's where we have the buzzing that happens. Harpists hate buzzing. We spend our whole lives trying not to buzz. But that register is particularly difficult just because of that resonance. Moving up, when you get above middle C, up about 2 octaves, this is really your sweet spot of the harp. You still have that warm sound from the gut strings, but the resonance is a lot shorter. So there's a lot less to worry about in there as far as buzzing and the resonance. And then you have your top register of the harp where you have those nylon strings. That's where you have your really bright sound. It sounds very percussive just because there's very little resonance or sustain. So you'll have that initial attack and then it dies away almost immediately.
Mm.
It's cool though in orchestra, that top register really projects through the orchestra. So you can use that strategically with doubling other instruments, just because it has that really piercing percussive quality. So there's a lot to think about. You can be really creative
Great.
with how you use all of these different registers and sounds and timbres across the harp.
Okay. Um, we'll talk about the pedals now. So the pedals are the fun part when you're kind of navigating what's possible with the harp. Um, so correct correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I understand is that there's a few things about the pedals that seem almost counterintuitive as someone familiar with other instruments, and that is we normally think of lift up for sharp and then lower for flat, but with pedals, if I'm not mistaken, you you lower it to make it sharp
Mhm.
and raise it to make it flat.
Yeah, it's always we're thinking down for sharp, up for flat, which is it's completely the opposite. The reason for that is because the pedals are attached to the action of the harp through the pedal rods, through the column. So as you change a pedal, it's turning a disc, which then raises the pitch of the string. So if you're thinking about it, when the pedals are in the top position, there's no tension on the string. You're releasing that tension, and that lowers the pitch. You move the pedal down one notch, you add some tension to the string. It has one disc that engages with the string and that raises the pitch. And then you put the pedal down all the way, you're adding all the tension to the string. You have two discs engaged, and brings it to sharp. So if you think of it in terms of no tension, the pedal's at the top position, you're adding tension as you lower the pedal, and that raises the pitch. But it is a little backwards.
Okay. I know that there are a variety of ways to indicate how the pedal should be notated
Mhm.
and so forth. But the way that I've seen the most common is kind of a diagram, of like where the pedal positions are. And then when there are pedal changes, those are just kind of in text and, sometimes in parentheses. But I'm
Mhm.
sure there's some other ways to go about it. But let's talk about that pedal diagram and just how your pedals are laid out. So, my wife told me, did Columbus bring enough food for going to America? Which, if you just kind of take out some of those words, you have three pedals on the left side of kind of a divider. So that's did Columbus bring DCB, and
Mhm.
then the rest is EFGA. So that's just kind of for the composer to have an image of like what the pedals look like. Do you have any other acronyms or sayings that you use for that, or?
I actually just think about it going through like the circle of fifths because the
Mhm.
way that the pedals are laid out are very intentional. So you have
Yes.
access to like these pairs of pedals. So the pedal diagram is such a great tool, both for
Mhm.
composers and harpists. We have them all over our music. As a composer, you don't need to put them all over the music. We
Right.
sometimes put extras in just for our own reference, depending on how many pedal changes are happened. So if you see my score from Wagner, I literally have a pedal change every measure just because of how many pedals are
Hmm.
going on. Most pieces, it'll be like one or two per page.
Yeah.
And if you're like publishing the score, it doesn't have to be that often. But the pedal chart is there just to kind of give you your layout of the pedals. So you have your two lines. You have your vertical line, which is really indicating where the harpist is in relation to the pedal. So that's the big line in the middle. Then you have your horizontal line, which is indicating your natural position. So the middle position of the pedals. Then
Hmm.
you have your little individual lines, which are going to be either be above the line, which is your flat, on the line, which is natural, below the line, which is your sharp. And then you have your individual pedals on that. You'll have three, like you mentioned, three on the left side, four on the right side. So here's where the circle of fifths comes into play. The two inner pedals are your B and your E. Those are your first two flats if you're thinking of the key signature.
Hmm.
We often will be changing those as pairs, so it makes a lot of sense for them to be kind of in the same place, mirroring each other. Then you have your C and your F,
Hmm.
first two sharps.
Yes.
Then D, G, and A. So those are kind of the inner ones, and those also tend to work in pairs as well. It's actually, for your purposes, it's actually not as important to remember which pedal is changed by which foot, but to remember kind of where they are. So if you're not sure, there's going to be the C changed by one foot, F changed by the other.
Right.
Those can move as pairs. If you forget which one is which foot, it's okay. But
Yeah.
you're really remembering those pairs as you're going because we can change pedals at the same time if they're on opposite sides of the harp. So I often really recommend composers just to have like a pedal chart diagram with you as you're composing. Different notation softwares will be really helpful for that, like Dorico, or you can just have like a dry erase board with your pedal diagram and have, just mark it as you go to keep track of where you are. That's a really useful tool just to make sure that what you're doing, there's room for the pedal changes to happen.
Right.
Then the other thing that you had mentioned, the pedal changes,
Yes.
that's where you're doing those individual changes. And I
Hmm.
really like to make it clear that the diagram and the changes are two different things. They
Yeah.
don't replace each other.
Right.
They both are, they're separate.
Hmm.
So the diagram is your landmark. So if you're writing directions, the landmark is you're going to be turning right at the gas station. The
Right.
pedal diagram is the gas station. The pedal change is you turn right. That's your
Right.
step-by-step direction. You need to have both of them. So I see so often pedal charts there instead of changes, and then there will be changes. We
Mm.
need both. We need both in the score.
Right.
There's also the big controversy of harpists like to do our own pedals, don't do them for us.
Hmm.
Um, I have very mixed feelings about that, but just be aware a lot of harpists will prefer to not have the pedals included in the score and to do it themselves. However, if you're writing for the harp, you should probably be thinking through the pedals as you're composing. Otherwise, you're going to end up with something that doesn't work strategically. And my opinion, if you're doing the work already, just leave them in there and have a harpist take a look and make sure they're right.
Right.
Why do
I
we want
don't.
to redo your work? Like,
I
there's
don't
no
think
reason.
I've. I don't think I've ever written a piece for harp where when I went through it, I, it was 100% correct in terms of like what I thought my pedals were at the time. It's like inevitably, it's like, wait a minute, I don't have G sharp in this section. It's G natural, and I never include that change. It's like I almost always find things like that.
I mean,
But
we do it too. We fill in pedals in
right,
the piece and then realize 2 weeks later that, oh, wait, that was supposed to be an F sharp.
right.
Courtesy accidentals help. So that's another thing to think through. But we're here to help you. You can ask a harpist for help. It's okay.
So here's a big question that I would have, and I think I've heard different answers of this. I just, for example, I just say. Let's say that I've got an ostinato going from a C major 7 to a C minor 7. And of course, that's C E G B and C E flat, G B flat. And that's exactly how it would look on a piano. But I'm going back and forth. Well, the harpist is not gonna want to do E flat, B flat, E natural, B natural with the pedals back and forth. Chances are, if they can get away with it, it'd be better to do like a D sharp and A sharp, that you could move from one to the other. If, this is just kind of an example, if that
Mhm.
works out. Well, to someone who studies music theory, it looks wrong to look at a C minor 7 as C, D sharp, G, A sharp. But that might be the best way for the harpist to play it. Now, what does the harpist prefer? Does the harpist want to see the way to play it, or do they want to see a way that theoretically makes more mainstream sense?
This is where the harp is just annoying, I'll say. But honestly, it makes a lot more sense to see the way that we would play it
Right.
rather than the theoretical way. This especially is true when you get into double sharps and double flats, which we get in a lot of the late romantic era music,
Yeah.
and those are not printed. We have to, but we're having to think about it differently. So the spelling means that we're playing it on a actually different string,
Hmm.
different pedals. So
Yeah.
it's not just like on the piano, yes, a G sharp is the same as an A flat because it's literally the same key that
Yeah.
you're playing. On the harp, it's not the same key. It's a different string, different pedals. So it's a really good idea to be thinking through those enharmonics. And again, this is a case, it's okay to ask a harpist if you're not sure. A lot of it does depend on the tempo and a lot of things like that. Is there time to change the pedals versus playing and harmonically? What makes the most sense? And a lot of it really just depends on the context of the piece.
Right. And I kind of skimmed over that when I was talking about, like, if you want to gliss a diminished seventh. That's seven strings. It's a four note chord, and I don't think I really emphasized that for those who, didn't, weren't picturing it in their head, or, maybe don't have as much of a knowledge of theory. But a C diminished seventh, you would use an A, of course, but B sharp and C natural are the same. It'd be the same key on the piano. It'd be a C. And then D sharp and E flat would be the same black key on the piano, and F sharp and G flat would be the same black key. So you've got three pairs of strings that are doubling,
Mm-hmm.
and create that effect.
It
And
sounds
that
so
is,
cool.
yeah, and that's something that the harp can do. It also, it's a way, also something I guess to keep in mind if you want the sound of a repeated note. Uh, I I don't think harpists really like to like repeat the same string over and over any more than a piano likes to do the same uh, key over and over. But you can inharmonically change a neighboring string like B and C sharp and play back and forth just fine.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds really great. And I have a feeling that's what's going on when you hear really rapid sounding notes like that. And the pianos do have a technique of 3-2-1 or 4-3-2-1 sideways on a key, but I don't know as far as like what harpists. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe you can play a string really fast, but I think the
No,
in
you're
use
correct.
probably.
Yeah, the issue, like the piano and harp have a lot of similarities, and things that are difficult on the piano are even more difficult on the harp. And the reason for that really goes into like the motion of actually physically playing a note on the harp. It takes a lot more motion because there's really four steps that go into that. You have to place, press the string, play the string by closing your hand, and then you reopen before you can replace again. So it's a lot more motion than simply just dropping your finger on the piano. So yeah, repeated notes on the piano are awkward, and you can do that really quick action, but it's not going to be as effective as like a wind instrument or a string instrument where they can do that repeated motion a little bit better. But on the harp, it's even more difficult and awkward. So a lot of the edits that I tend to make in music are avoiding quickly repeating notes, especially when they're like these hidden repeated notes, like within a texture of a chord, because it
Right.
just doesn't work quite so well. So doing enharmonic equivalents can work really nicely. Sometimes it's just a question of, do you have to actually repeat the note?
Right.
Because on the harp, it's already going to be ringing. Maybe you don't actually have to repeat it. It's going to be more resonant if you just let it sustain and play a different note.
Right.
So there's a lot of little decisions that you can make. on the harp.
How much should be notated by the composer? Like if you want a note to be a staccato, like do you have to make the instruction damp or something like that, or will the harpist just do that naturally? If it's a staccato, they know they've got to damp the strings, that they just played.
So if I'm being really honest, harpists tend to just kind of gloss over staccatos because a
Right,
lot of the time there's not actually enough time to stop the note
right.
on the string. It has to be like there has to be space for that because again, that takes a second motion to come back and make the staccato. So I always recommend have like maybe two types of layers to notate the staccato
Hmm.
just to reinforce like yes, I want this note short. This note should be short. Please make the note short. So having the staccato and then like a rest after it or a staccato and the muffle sign after it or just in some way be like reinforce that you want a staccato.
Okay.
Another trick though, we talked about the repeated notes.
Hmm.
What happens with repeated notes is they don't sound quite as resonant because you have to come back on that same string, which stops the sound of the string before you
Right.
can play it again.
Yeah.
That's also
Hmm.
the definition of a staccato. So if you want something staccato, repeated notes is the way to go because
Right.
you have that muffle motion built in to the
Yeah.
replaying motion. So you don't have to eliminate repeated notes. You can use them effectively and creatively if you're wanting that type of sound in your music.
Okay. I almost skipped over a very important question about pedals, and that is how much time do harpists need to change pedals? And is that timing affected by their constantly busy with their hands? Is it an independent motion, or does it get slowed down with certain passages? But generally speaking, like how much time should I allow for if you want to do it like per pedal or per two pedals, like if I'm going from I don't know C major to C sharp major, I mean, and it's a wholesale change. Uh, how much time would you need?
Yeah, that's probably the number one question I get asked
Right.
about pedals. So there's a lot of layers that go into that, but I tend to, just like as a general rule, aim for one pedal change or pair of pedal changes per beat.
Hmm.
Try not to do more than that. By pair, I mean if you have two pedals on the opposite sides of the harp that you can change at the same time, that can count as a pedal change. So if you're going from C major to C sharp major, that's going to take two sets of pedal changes because you would have to change like the G and C together or the G and E together. And then you have to additionally change one more on the right side of the harp. So that would take two beats to actually get there. Can a harpist do it quicker? Probably, depending on what all is going on. Yes, the pedal changes are independent of what the hands are doing, but that's another level of like coordination. So if there's a lot of complicated stuff going on in the hands with, different voices, jumps, you might want to scale back on pedal changes. Or if there's a section where the pedal changes, there's a lot going on pedal wise, think about maybe having the hands working together a little bit, moving in, parallel motion, playing the same thing. So simplify the hands to allow for more difficult pedals. Another layer that doesn't get talked about a lot is just the balance of the harp playing in the different registers and how that affects the pedals. So if you're playing in the top register of the harp, usually I'm balancing the harp against my knee and my shoulder. But playing in the top, I have to actually bring my shoulder away from the harp to reach there, which means the harp is balanced by my knee, which
Hmm.
means I can't move that leg quite as quickly around the pedals.
Right.
Second, if I'm playing at the bottom register, I'm leaning forward. I'm really balancing the harp mostly with my shoulders, but that hunched over position really changes my maneuverability around the pedals. So I'm going to be a little slower with pedals if I'm playing in the bottom. So again, if you're playing in, the extreme registers of the harp, maybe allow a little extra time for pedals or simplify the pedals. Or if you want something, really complex with the pedals, think about using more of that mid range of the harp.
Well, great.
That's a very long-winded answer to your
Oh,
question.
no, 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 that's
Um,
fine. That's
but as a
exactly.
general rule, like aim
Yeah.
for like one pedal change per beat, unless it's like a really fast tempo, then one every two beats.
Yeah.
But try not to do more than that within a beat, especially not for a long duration of time.
Right.
Don't do Wagner, please.
Right. So we kind of mentioned, like looking at the Tchaikovsky Nutcracker Waltz of the Flowers is a good example of like don't follow exactly what you see. Don't look at this and learn how to write for the harp, or don't use it as a good example. Um, Obviously, there are harp specific composers, harpist composers. So, kind of excluding them, are there mainstream composers that you've played that you think they seem to get it? Like their harp playing is very idiomatic, and you don't have to make a lot of changes. Any composers like that that you've played?
So, one really, really interesting example is Benjamin Britten.
Mhm.
And he did work a lot with harpist Ocean Ellis. And it's really interesting to see the difference in his music pre-Ocean and post-Ocean.
Right,
So, like the one of his earlier works was the Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra. The harp
right,
part's okay. Does have that big cadenza. It's a little awkward. It doesn't work super well.
right.
But some of the pieces that came after this collaboration, the Ceremony of Carols, I think, was written pre-collaboration, but then he worked with Ocean on this piece. That works
Mhm.
beautifully on the harp. And then there were a lot of like harp and voice songs like Birthday Hansel, folk songs. There's a couple ones like that that work really, really well on the harp. And it's because of, that little collaboration that they had going on to help refine some of the ideas. So we love having non-harpist composers because you all bring so much creativity. You try things that we would never think of trying, just because we're ingrained like, oh, you don't do this, maybe you
Right.
can do it. I love it when composers bring ideas and I'm like, I don't know if that'll work, and then I try it, I'm like, oh my god, this actually worked and this sounds so cool. So bring your ideas, but having the collaboration with the harpist is really lovely. As far as like other mainstream composers, Debussy
Hmm.
always works really lovely on the harp, especially the orchestral harp parts.
Yeah.
Especially in terms of like the orchestration, the harp part is so strategic. It's
Mhm.
always heard, it's always effective, it's never wasted.
Right.
But it works really beautifully compared to Strauss, which has Richard Strauss.
Yes.
Fun harp parts, you cannot hear them. Like,
Right.
I'm practicing this. It's so awkward. It takes so much work, and you're never going to hear it.
Yeah.
So that's some of the things to think about. And then, of course, there's current composers as well that I'm
Right.
playing music from my YouTube channel. That most of them are non-harpist composers, and it's been so fun to work with them and see their ideas. And it's usually just little tweaks that we make together. I don't go through and just like say, oh, we're changing all of this. I
Right.
usually tend to be like, hey, this is a little awkward for this reason. Here's some ideas. What do you think? And sometimes we stick with the original idea because it's a specific sound that they're wanting. I'm like, okay, if there's like a couple awkward sections, that's fine. I'm not trying to simplify everything. But sometimes
Yeah.
it's more a sound that we can achieve better in different ways.
Yeah. I was glad to hear you mention the Benjamin Britten, the interlude, the harp interlude from Ceremony of Carols is maybe one of my favorite excerpts for the harp.
Mhm.
I just always enjoy listening to that, and it's actually um, for people who like the movie A Christmas Story. It's briefly hinted at on the Christmas morning when Ralphie wakes up and sees the snow. So there's actually a lot of classical pieces in that in
Oh
that
yeah.
score. So,
No, that
um,
interlude is so fun to play. It's And then there's the suite for harp. I can't believe I forgot to mention that by Britten.
right,
I love that piece. It's so fun to play. And
right,
it works well. It uses a lot of like non-traditional sounds and elements, especially for that time period.
right,
We play it a little bit differently than we do other harp music, but it
right,
works really well. And I think it's because Ocean had a fairly distinctive sound, and that was reflected in the music.
right. Also, just for composers out there, I mean, this is something you can find quite easily from just a little bit of score study, but really from late 19th century music, early 20th century onward, if you want an ambitious harp part, having two harpists in your score is actually quite common.
Mhm.
I know, like you can't pick up a Stravinsky score without, or Debussy really, without seeing two harpists in the score, and that just gives you a combination of pedal changes, that you can get almost a chromatic sound if you do it just right. So
Yeah, another one to like be able to see this interplay between two harps in an orchestral setting is The Planets by Holst.
Yes.
Um, so effective with that use of two harps, especially Mercury, where you literally have the two harps in two different keys to be able to get that bitonal feel. It's so strategic. And then, the last movement where you have alternating between different Bisbigliando chords, and that only works because you have one harp playing, then the next harp plays while one harp changes the pedals, and then they alternate like this dovetail
Right.
scenario.
I recently, I mentioned that uh, episode, I think it was episode 16 about score study with Andrew Callow. I actually pulled out the planets and read through the beginning of Mars, just my notes. And one of the notes that I made was there's two harps, and one harp is going from low G to high G and back, and the other one's going from the higher G to the low G, the same two Gs, but they're doing in opposite directions. And if you hear it together, it sounds like octaves.
Hmm.
It's a da 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 dun 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 dun. But one's going da 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 dun 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 dun, and the other one's going da 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 dum 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 dum. And and I guess if you place the harps, maybe not super close together, if you were creative, you could actually get a stereo effect.
Hmm.
That could be an adventurous combination for a conductor. There's a lot of things that the harp can do, and I feel like we probably don't have time to like give everything justice. But one of the differences, obviously, between the harp and the piano is that piano really, unless you open up the lid and start playing around with the strings, there's not a lot that you can do to affect the tone. But harpists can play on different, like vertical portions of the harp to change the sound. Like you can go higher, towards your pegs, and you can get harmonics, in certain ways. And there's also, I mean, there's all kinds of different effects, and it's like there's the word I can never pronounce unless I'm looking at it. It was like bisblion.
Bisbigliando.
Yes, thank you. It's
We
like I always
abbreviate
have
it Bisbig.
I have to
Um,
I have to look that up. But maybe just I don't know, in 3 or 4 minutes, what are some of the effects that you can do on the harp for modern composers to think
Yeah,
about?
there's so many.
Yeah.
If you're looking for like a good resource just to kind of see what's out there, harpnotation.com. This was a doctoral project from a harpist. I don't remember her name offhand, but she has so many examples there, written examples, demonstrations, just to kind of see what all is out there. That's my number one suggestion. But if you're thinking about different ideas, you have the what David mentioned, playing down at the bottom of the soundboard called pressé la table or PDLT. That gives you more of like a nasally sound versus the resonant sound you get in the middle of the string. Again, you have harmonics. Usually you're just getting the octave harmonic. Um, and you do that by like kind of muffling the middle of the string to get that harmonic node where it rings an octave higher. You can also get a little bit more creative, do higher partial harmonics. That's not really a standard technique, so I would kind of work with the harpist on that one. I do have one piece that I play right now, Wasatch Crest by Kincaid Rab, that has, you're really going through all of those different harmonic partials. It's so difficult and it's so fun. Um, and then there's like a myriad of really special effects you can do, like gong. You can do thunder glissandos where you do like a really loud glissando in the wire strings, loud
Hmm.
enough so that they rattle against each other. Um, Super cool. Like there's just so many things that you can do because you're physically playing the strings and you can manipulate that sound in a way that you can't on the piano.
Right.
You can also do like a prepared harp. Um, Work with a harpist on that one also, just because there's different people at different comfort levels. But things like weaving paper between the strings is pretty safe.
Yeah.
Party beads, scarves, so you have like a muffled sound. Aluminum foil is my favorite.
Hmm.
Like there's so many different things that you can do
And
with the
because
harp.
the harp is so resonant, it's actually, it can be a percussive instrument. It's like you
Hmm.
can do drum, drumming parts, with one hand or both hands if you want to do that. So, um, I did fail to mention, we talked about pedal diagrams for composers. Um, there are plenty of articles out there of how to draw a diagram in Finale or Sibelius. I have one that I got from Harp Column magazine many years ago, that I saved, but I just did a quick Google search. It's like there's all kinds of resources you could check out and see which one works for you, but it just involves the shape designer. I know for Finale, and you can save it, and you know, I think there may even be a keyboard shortcut that I've used before, but
Mhm.
but yeah, that's something that you can do with, and it's not super difficult, but you probably want to get a little tutorial first.
I can
Um,
also send you a link to a presentation I recently did that with a notation expert who like went through a bunch of different plugins that you can use for that.
right. And we also have, it's a universal system now. It's like a smoofle. I can never pronounce it, but it's unique to like Finale 26 or 27, whichever, I can't remember which version was most responsible for that. But like Dorico and Sibelius, like they all use this universal font
Mhm.
now. So what works for one, you can export to another. This does not fit the specific episode that we talked about, but it does fit the specific podcast that we're doing, and that is, I love practice tips. And you said that you have an approach to practice that you would be willing to share, that's kind of a little bit different than just slowing down. So
Mhm.
what is a practice strategy or tip that you could share with us?
So I have actually completely changed how I practice. And a lot of this is due to actually mountain biking, where I realized slow practice is very different than fast practice. Like the technique that you would use slow to like get over an obstacle, it's so different than the technique that you use fast. Therefore,
Yeah.
slow practice does not necessarily help you play fast. I think that's especially true on the harp as well. The
Mm-hmm.
articulation that we would be using to play something slow is not the same as fast.
Mm-hmm.
So I made that shift in my practice and I've started focusing more of my practice on playing fast. That doesn't mean I just play through a whole piece fast as I'm learning it, because you're going to learn wrong notes that way and all of those things. But I do like tiny chunks up to tempo. And my goal is always to get a piece up to tempo as quickly as possible. And I think that's helped with my performance confidence a lot more, because if you're playing something really slow, you don't have that fast muscle memory to be able to play fast when the nerves kick in. Then it's going to feel really unfamiliar. So playing fast, tiny sections, and then you start to expand those sections.
Right.
I found that that works really well. So I'm always encouraging people, practice fast, because then you can see, does the fingering that I choose work up to tempo? Because sometimes it works slow, and then you have to do something different when it gets fast. Um, so slow practice is important, but don't only practice slow.
Right.
It also takes a little bit of strategy. So your goal is to practice fast, or your goal is to
Yeah.
play fast. What tools do you need to get there? Sometimes you need slow practice, especially for like rhythm work and figuring stuff out. Sometimes you need fast to be able to learn the motions getting between different notes. So I always try to think of it, okay, what's my goal? What am I going to try to achieve in this practice section? What tools am I going to use to actually get
Right.
there?
One of my local colleagues is a famous, I mean, pretty famous as far as piano teachers go. Her name is Barbara Lister Sink, and she's got a whole injury preventive course and really focuses on ergonomic technique. And in her video, Freeing the Caged Bird, that was the first time that I had heard someone suggest she never does slow practice, but is always finding logical groups, phrases, and just learning them in chunks. And sometimes it might be two notes, sometimes it might be eight notes. You never know,
Mm-hmm.
just kind of works on that. So but that harmonizes with everything. Even when I teach slow practice, I always teach you never practice as if you're watching a video in slow motion, but it's more of a, you're going full tempo, but someone keeps pressing pause. It's
Mm-hmm.
like you take that time to think, and then you go, and then you stop, and then you go, and then you stop. and,
And in
and
all honesty, it takes a lot less thought work to play in slow motion. You
yes,
can watch TV and practice slow. I don't
yeah,
know if that's actually effective. I would rather spend 15 minutes practicing strategically and
right,
then 45 minutes watching TV instead of an hour practicing slowly while watching TV. Um,
right. Well, I'll go ahead and just since I'm the host here and I'm influencing listeners, I'm going to go ahead and say right now, don't practice while you're watching TV. I've watched I probably this year I've read three books that all made a big point of that multitasking is a myth. What you can do is switch your attention back and forth really quickly. Like if you're practicing and watching TV, you can keep up with both, but it's like harp TV, harp TV, harp TV. And what you're not getting the full you're not really getting every nuance out of the show unless it's just something you've seen a lot,
Hmm.
and you're not fully paying attention to your harp. So now you can enjoy both, like if you just want to, I just feel like playing harp and I feel like watching TV. You can do both at the same time and enjoy both. But if you want to, if your goal is to improve, you want to avoid those other distractions in front of you. That's just kind of my opinion based on what I've read. But
Yeah, or if you're short on time, it's
yeah,
better to spend like 15 really focused minutes rather than an hour of distracted. Because I mean, my life right now, I have a toddler. I don't have as much time to practice as I used to. But
yeah,
I would say with being more intentional and focused and strategic with my practice, I'm performing better than I did in college, where I was practicing 6 hours a day of not quite as efficient practice because I didn't have to be efficient. I did have to be efficient, but not in the same way.
Um, so you've shared quite a bit about, working with composers, but you also have courses and ways that composers and orchestrators can find out more about, what you would recommend. So I guess let's just start with, first of all, where can people follow you? I know you're on social media quite a few places, and then how can people get in touch to find out more about your courses?
Yeah. So I'm on most of the socials at Danielle Kuntz Harp or Twitter, Danielle K Harp. You can also, it's all linked on my website, daniellekuntz.com. Um, the course is super fun. I'm going back and forth between teaching it as it's available as like a self study option if you're just wanting something like a resource or you don't have the time to do something live. And then I do have like a virtual option as well where you can do it in a more interactive way. There's just so many details that go into teaching the harp or teaching writing for the harp. And I could do like a 2 week lecture on it. This
Yeah.
is not a 2 week like lecture, but I try to keep it very focused, time efficient, so you can learn the tools that you need to get a good understanding of the harp so that you can then be really creative in how you write for it. It's not about, locking you into a little box and you can only do these things. It's just giving you those fundamentals. So I enjoy doing that. We go through, it's about 5 modules where you go through different areas of the harp, talking about the technique, talking about the pedals, talking about the formatting, how to make a readable score, and then strategies for like exploring extended techniques if that's something that you want. And all of those details are on my website. You can also sign up for my email list just to get be in the know if when the next enrollment period opens.
Well, that's great. Well, Danielle, thank you for taking time to share with us today. And I just encourage everyone just reach out and also, if you're a composer, want to write some music, you may have quite a few pieces already, to work on, but maybe reach out and just to get your advice and see if it's something, if there's collaboration is possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And then if you're like working with another harpist or writing for someone else and you just, want a second opinion on something, I do have score consults that I offer, or just like reach out, say hi.
Okay.
I always like to hear when composers are writing for the harp.
Oh, excellent. Well, thank you so much for being a guest today.
Thank you.
And that's going to wrap up episode number 28. I want to thank you so much for listening. And just a reminder, if you have a private studio of any kind, you should check out the Fonz app through the link in my show notes. There's a free trial. I often forget to actually tell you how it is that they describe their product, but this is what they say. They say that your dream job shouldn't come with a catch. Writing invoices, chasing payments, rescheduling via countless emails, booking with spreadsheets, juggling multiple platforms. Forget that. Fonz replaces hours of admin work with just a few taps of an app so that you can focus on teaching and free up your time and keep your sanity while getting paid predictably. So, there are words not mine, but that is my experience. If you enjoyed this episode, I would request a couple of things. If you'd please rate it 5 stars and offer a review if you feel so inclined on the app of your choice, specifically if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Although I don't think Spotify allows a review, but you can at least rate it. And no matter where you're listening, even if you're on YouTube, I would love it if you would take the link for this episode and please share it with a friend, especially share it with your composer friends so that they can learn more about composing for the harp in a way that will sound good and make harpists your friend. Well, that's all I have for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll be back with you again next week.